It's the week ending Saturday the 23rd of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Boris Johnson announcing Southend will get city status in memory of murdered MP Sir David Amess, the state of California recording its driest year since 1924, and the death of Colleen Powell, the first African-American US Secretary of State, at the age of 84. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kate Samuelson and Julia O'Driscoll. And from Money Week, the man who makes largely indecipherable financial news as digestible as a wet McVitie's, it's Mr. John Stepek. And John, you are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Well, the government's green push hurt house prices.
Consumer spending in the UK per capita is almost a third higher than our friends in the EU, because we're going through three huge transformations in this country, each of them driving the other and each helping to make this place a better place to invest. And the first is the Green Industrial Revolution, the 10-point plan, the new decalogue that I brought down from Sinai last year, which is today being elaborated in our plan for net zero to build back greener.
The Prime Minister speaking at the Global Investment Summit on Tuesday, ahead of next week's COP26 conference in Glasgow. John, what's the story?
So obviously the government's put out its net zero strategy, and it wants to get us all greener and more fuel efficient for 2035 in particular. But among the many other things they want to do, they want to improve the energy efficiency of all the homes in the UK. And the way that they want to go about that, at least partly, is by essentially twisting the arms of both buyers, sellers and mortgage lenders to incentivise people based on how energy efficient their homes are.
Okay, how does a mortgage lender incentivise you to make your house more energy efficient?
So what will happen is the government is asking mortgage lenders. Now, none of this is set in stone. There's been a consultation which is closed, and now they're going to give out their recommendations probably early next year. We all have energy performance certificates for our houses. When you buy a house or you rent a house, you get something that's a bit like that thing that's stuck on your washing machine, and it goes from A for the most energy efficient to G for the least energy efficient. Now, the government wants to get all homes up to C. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to ask mortgage lenders to record the energy performance certificates of the homes that they're lending to, and also encourage or force them to get the homes in their portfolio up to C by 2030. The idea here is that by doing so, it'll both encourage them to lend homeowners money cheaply to upgrade their homes, but also presumably it will encourage mortgage lenders to penalise homes that have less than a C energy performance certificate. So for example, if you want to go and remortgage your house that you've owned for 10 years and you come to the end of your fixed rate and it turns out that you've got a kind of D or an E, the mortgage lender could maybe say, well, either we'll lend to you at this rate, this higher rate because you've got a duff old house, or we'll lend to you at this lower rate but you're going to have to borrow more money so that you upgrade your, get rid of your gas boiler or something like that. So it's it's mostly stick approach, frankly. Actually, there's not a lot of carrots involved here at all.
Yeah, and not actually really about recommending mortgage lenders do something, Julia, or, asking or inquiring or discovering. This sounds like threatening. This sounds to me like the government is currently putting this forward as a proposal, but actually this is about threatening homeowners, isn't it, with improving their homes or else?
Yeah, it does very much feel like the burden of making homes more energy efficient is falling on homeowners and individuals, and that's kind of long been a criticism of government actions towards tackling climate change, is that more often than not it falls on kind of the willingness of individuals, but also the pockets as well. This could be really costly for homeowners as well. One estimate said that if you were to make all the energy efficient improvements to your home possible, it would cost a total of more than £25,000. So it's a really significant amount.
And that's hard enough to think about, Kate, in the scenario that John was painting, where you might want to remortgage a property you already have mortgaged. But I suppose there's an element of choice there. For first-time buyers, this is yet another thing with rising house prices to worry about.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The announcement actually prompted a lot of warnings that first-time buyers may struggle to obtain mortgages unless they pay for really costly upgrades to their prospective home, costs in the region of what Julia was just talking about. So we're talking about really high amounts. The Lib Dems have actually been really vocal opposing this move. The leader of the Lib Dem party, Ed Davey, he actually called it an insult to first-time buyers who have scraped and saved to get on the housing ladder. And he criticised the Tories, saying that they're attempting to clean up their own mess, basically by forcing first-time buyers to fork out thousands of pounds extra. So putting the burden on them rather than on the government or other people to cover that cost.
But John, this doesn't feel like a natural Conservative policy either, does it? I know it involves, private companies, and that's how Boris Johnson is pitching it to the mortgage providers, isn't it? We need the private sector to help us. I suppose that bit is Conservative. But it's a financial penalty and telling people how to live their lives. That doesn't feel like a Tory vote winner.
I totally agree. I would take issue with the idea that Boris Johnson's a traditional small C Conservative low, because he never has been. So this is in line with a kind of Johnson-esque thing rather than a Tory thing. From the point of view, the idea is it's sort of getting individuals and a sort of market-based element involved. And so theoretically, the idea, for example, that, if you've been living in the house, say, for 10 years, and it is an older house, and it does have a kind of low energy rating, chances are that your house price has shot up during that time. And there's one argument to be said that being forced to remove some of that equity to kind of upgrade the home is not necessarily bad or unfair. I don't agree with that, because I think obviously it's very scattergun kind of approach. I think the main problem I actually have with this is there's an element of fairness, but there's also the question of how useful are these measures and how likely are they to change over time. I was looking at our EPC recently, and I got quite a surprise when I realised our house, the house we're living in, is an F, so it's like one grade from the lowest one. And I was looking at it, and the insulation is fine. The roof is fine. The problem is with our heating. But the thing is, we are in a village that isn't connected to the mains gas supply. So we've got electric heating, and electric heating was the thing that's dragging it down. But of course, electricity is what all of our future heating is going to run on.
Yes, if it's green electricity, then that's the greenest way to heat your house.
Exactly, and apparently, certainly until recently when they all went bust, I was signed up to an electricity provider that apparently was getting all of the electricity going into my house from a wind turbine somewhere in the North Sea. So actually, why am I getting penalised when it doesn't actually matter how much electricity I use, technically speaking, because it's all coming from a wind farm or a solar farm?
Well, when you say why are you getting penalised, can we put a figure on it? What would it cost you to do what the government wants you to do? Do you know?
Well, it's tricky, but I'm looking at it. I'm guessing that presumably the best place to go would be to switch out the electricity that we've got for a heat pump. So these are the things that are like reverse fridges. And as far as I can see, the prices for them go from about 10 to 20 grand for installing. I can't imagine the electricity bill would be much higher for it. But 10 to 20 grand is 10 to 20 grand I don't actually have, so that's an issue. And then of course there's the fact that even by mentioning this, and I think this is kind of worth noting for everyone right now, the immediate impact of this is that people will start paying attention to the EPCs, and they will start pricing in a little premium on new builds, which again is hard for first-time buyers, because first-time buyers are the ones that are buying the new builds. And it will start to make ones with lower end EPCs like mine worth less in the eyes of the market. And over time, that could actually become an issue for people who are hoping to rely on their house as a retirement savings vehicle, for example.
But actually, Julia, it's not just new builds that first-time buyers end up moving into, is it? Because of the nature of Britain's housing market. We have, old cottages, listed properties, You know, they don't have to be glamorous sort of Cotswold stone cottages we're talking about here. You know, flat block from the 1960s and the 1970s would have the same issue, wouldn't it? Old pipes. You could spend loads of money on this sort of stuff, get a new heat pump, and actually your house could still be colder at the end of this. You're not actually going to have an improvement because of the way the house was built.
That is a really good point. It's a very interesting one until we've got kind of more information and substance to kind of policy, how this will be regulated. I think there's just so many unanswered questions around implementation at the moment. And I think even before you look at homeowning, like many people in the UK are renting, and I think it's 1 in 5 properties in the UK roughly at the moment are owned by private landlords. And I would love if our landlord said, yes, I'm going to up your energy rating and it will bring my bills down. But there's no conversation about that happening, and it is generally better. Energy efficiency in social housing is typically better than private rented properties, but I think that is also slightly being overlooked in this conversation.
Is it being overlooked, John? Has there been any talk of we also need to basically threaten private landlords to increase their energy as well? Because there are minimum standards, aren't there, if you want to rent out privately already?
There are. I mean, if you're G rated, then you can't rent out a property. And obviously, the other thing is, I think what's worth remembering is if you're a private renter, then the landlord you're renting from owns the property as well. So, this mortgage-wise, this will affect them just as much as it will an owner-occupier if they want to go in and sell it. And to be honest, the other thing I think is, again, worth remembering is that private landlords have kind of been in the government's sights over the past 5 to 10 years. And to be honest, I can just see those regulations getting tighter and tighter. So I don't think they're being excluded, to be honest. I suspect that they'll come under a lot more pressure.
And yet, Kate, you know, we've talked about all of the problems with this, okay, but I suspect if you ask the average person in the street, you know, are these climate targets a good idea? Most people either say yes or actually we're not doing enough. So it's just a fact, isn't it, that if we're going to meet the kind of robust targets people say they want, that does mean individuals making changes to our lives.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think this is a classic case of never going to be able to please everyone. You know, you've got people on one side saying that you know, who's going to carry the load of this? Who's going to pay the financial cost that this is going to be? It's going to cost, I think it was around $1 trillion. I mean, John, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a lot of money and it's not clear exactly where that's going to come. Will that be the taxpayer? But then on the other hand, you've got activists, campaigners, you've got the Labour Party saying that these plans really fall short of the action that's needed to deal with what is a climate crisis. You know, they're saying these plans just don't go far enough, and setting targets for years like 2035 and further 2050 for net zero is actually too far away, and we need to be making plans that will come into place and bring these targets nearer.
Julia.
Boris this week was saying it's the trillions of the market that are going to make the difference in this crisis, but only £450 million have been set aside for subsidies for installing expensive heat pumps, as John was saying earlier. So, you know, we're acknowledging that so much more money is needed, and yet the level of funding that has been allocated to start making these improvements over the next 3 years is incredibly low. It's estimated that between 2022 and 2025, with that much funding, 90,000 heat pumps could be installed. And by 2028, the government wants the UK to have 600,000 heat pumps installed annually. So to go from kind of 30,000 a year to 200,000 a year over the next 6 years, there's just a lack of clarity about that funding, how it's going to increase. Is that actually realistic?
But I suppose what is very clear is the direction of travel, isn't it, John? You know, we know that Boris Johnson wants us all to think that he thinks the environment is important. We know that we are being asked to make personal decisions. We know that the government thinks £90 billion, I saw written down somewhere, of private investment by 2030 will be going into green industries. I suppose unless big announcements like this are made, then that direction of travel can't happen. They sort of need it to happen.
Yeah, and you know, the things, they're already nudging things in this direction. I mean, I think what's interesting here partly is the deployment of this idea of green finance. So the government's already borrowing money from global markets by issuing green gilts, so that's green government debt. That is because because institutions around the world effectively now have to sort of like, because of the ESG thing and the green thing, they're clamouring for assets that are described as green. It actually costs the government less to borrow if they slap the label green on the debt. Now, what then happens is that as long as they can say they're spending all this money on green infrastructure, and basically it's all green now, then they'll be able to keep doing that. And so, we'll be able to borrow money at a lower rate as a nation. But then what they do is that they leverage that by forcing the kind of mortgage lenders to get involved in green lending too. So I can actually see, I mean, where's the heat pump money going to come from? It's going to come from the likes of you and I having to slap it on our mortgage and then get it installed because, arms are being twisted all the way up the chain. So yeah, it's a sort of financial coercion, for want of a better word.
If this policy stays in place though, Kate, I mean, cynically, you could say we're just ahead of the COP26 conference. Will this be quietly ditched after that? They just need this sort of greenwashing spin right now.
Yeah, I think it's definitely interesting that Boris Johnson, who's not in the past historically been someone who's spoken out or seemed to care loads about climate change, it's now become a really major policy for him, and the roadmap that he's created is world leading in a lot of ways. So there is a lot of cynicism about how long this will last. I think it is very important that we are showing that we're world leading, especially as we're hosting, as you said, COP26. But it's really important that people stay energized by these plans, that they remain in the forefront of the news and of conversation topics, that the government does prioritize climate change, because this issue isn't going to go away after COP26. It's here to stay, and we need to act quickly and decisively.
Okay, Julia, you're up next after this. Listeners, as the news becomes more polarised, it's easy to fall into an echo chamber just when it's more important than ever to be open-minded to other points of view. And that is where The Week magazine comes in. Each week, our editors curate the best of the week's British and international media, presenting you with all sides of the debate so you can make up your own mind on the issues that matter most. And you, podcast listeners, can now get a free trial of The Week magazine. To receive 6 free issues plus free digital access, visit theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code podcast. You won't have to pay anything for 6 weeks and can cancel anytime, no strings attached. That's theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code podcast. Okay, Julia, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
TikTokers are talking trash.
And this is everything that I found in one night at one location. There are nearly 100 loaves or packages of bread here, and this is just part one. We also found cases of olive oil, brand new baby food, toilet paper, and so much more. And the worst part is, none of this stuff was expired. Everything that I found was at least 2 days before its best by date and could have easily been donated, frozen, or given to people who needed it. Fortunately, we were able to donate over 90% of what we found to our local food bank, but honestly, this is not okay.
TikTok user Dumpster Diving Freegan in a video she posted earlier this week. Julia, she likes to rummage through bins and then make videos about it. Why?
So Dumpster Diving Freegan is calling out companies who have a problem with waste, and particularly stock and inventory that could have been sold, that it's in a perfectly good condition, or if not sold, it could be donated to other non-profits that would find a use for it, but hasn't been. So freegan was actually a new word for me, but I looked it up and it means someone who reclaims and eats food that is in an edible condition but has been discarded.
So free as in you don't pay for it because you fished it out of a trash can.
Exactly. And then gan, I guess kind of like vegan, there's a kind of a ethical, moral reason to do this, and environmental. And she's accrued quite a following. It's quite impressive. I've got quite mesmerised scrolling through her TikTok. She does it all the time.
What else has she found? What else has she found in a bin?
Hygiene products is a big one. There was also one with like kilos and kilos of discarded chocolate, lots of Valentine's chocolate, things like that. But she was saying that hygiene products and things that are kind of snack bars are really good because they all obviously are in individual packaging, as so much of kind of supermarket products are. They're all in packaging, so actually when they're thrown out, getting them out of a dumpster, generally there's not really a hygiene problem.
Okay, so I mean, it's compelling social media content, isn't it? It has that kind of OMG factor. You look at it, you're like, what? They threw away what? But why is this news? Why is this your story of the week?
So I think what's interesting is the momentum that dumpster diving is gaining, especially on TikTok. So the week before, Coach, which is a fashion brand, was called out by another TikTok user who went dumpster diving and found that they'd been slashing their bags. So stock that hadn't been sold, they were purposefully being destroyed so that the company could basically say that the stock was a tax write-off. So damaged returned goods are a tax write-off for them. And it's kind of the momentum that these stories are gaining. TikTok is a new platform that is tackling this issue and kind of garnering new audiences of more environmentally aware. And they are breaking out of the TikTok sphere into the news with kind of increasing momentum. So I think it's quite interesting to see where this could go next.
Yes. I think Coach have disputed, haven't they, the tax credit issue, although it is documented that brands do get tax credits by declaring some of their stock as null and void, and these are designer handbags that were found in a bin outside their shop. So, I mean, draw your own conclusions. Kate, what did you make of this? Do you think we're going to see more? We're going to see a spiral of activism of people fishing around in bins here in the UK as well to name and shame our supermarkets?
In some ways, I hope that we do see more, because actually these stories show that this kind of activism on social media can be really successful. In fact, the video that Julia was talking about the Coach slashing and dumpster diving, that actually led to Coach being forced to respond because the video gained just so much attention and responses from TikTok users. It literally forced them to respond to the claims, and they actually pledged to stop destroying what they described as unsellable products. If this one activist has managed to cause Coach to literally change their policies to make them better for the environment, then I really encourage seeing more of this. Perhaps it's actually a really effective way that activists can create change.
Yeah, I saw a statement from Whole Foods about this as well, John, in which they said that in 2020 alone they donated more than 27 million meals to redistribution programs in the US. So it's not as if these companies do nothing to try and reduce their waste. I guess you can just sort of imagine, can't you, that that's, you know, pizza and coffee and stuff from the salad bar, but probably not these kind of products. This lady had found, like, you know, olive oil, stuff that just like high premium value stuff that's almost at its best by day, but not quite. And you just wonder if maybe individual managers in a big national retail chain like that just make their own decisions about what to do with some of those grey area products.
Well, I suppose, it's one of these difficult ones where, I mean, a lot of this stuff, and it's the same as the handbags and things like that, is stuff that people just aren't going to buy. So, like, if you're going to Whole Foods, you're not generally a poor person, to put it bluntly. You're somebody who's got a fair amount of disposable income. And so if you go to the olive oil section, you're not going to buy the one that's next to its sell-by date. You're going to buy the one that's, you know, a year or however long olive oil lasts for. So you can understand why this happens. But I think that it's very useful from the point of view of making people understand how these businesses work and how the supply chain works, and what our consumption habits actually encourage, if you like. You know, I'm all for consumer choice, but I like the fact that these people are revealing, right, well, this is what that results in. Because, I mean, let's be very straightforward here. These companies, if they're getting rid of this stuff in that way, it's because it's the cheapest way to do it and the most efficient way in terms of the way that they're incentivized. So for people to start to understand, well, look, this is why we throw this stuff away, and this is what would need to happen if we wanted that to change. I think that's useful, and I think that, as I say, sort of getting more transparency in the way these systems work is kind of very helpful if we want to get to a point where it does change.
So I thought it was probably worth mentioning that actually there's a lot of laws around food expiration, which means in the case of places like Whole Foods, sometimes they legally can't give away food after the sell-by date, or they could risk being sued. And I think that's a massive disincentive for these food companies to redistribute their waste, I suppose, because they're worried about the financial repercussions. And I think that's why there's been a really interesting movement in recent years of apps as well, like Olio and Too Good To Go. They're just two ones in the UK that I've actually used before, which kind of help redistribute the waste for you.
It's different for designer brands though, isn't it, Julia? Because a supermarket, however premium a supermarket, is still at the end of the day a supermarket. Everyone knows that their goods are perishable and at some point they need to be eaten or they're going to get thrown away. But when you're talking about a designer handbag that is made of the finest quality materials, one kind of presumes that the reason to destroy that is because you don't want it ending up in TK Maxx, basically. Like there's a brand problem with your high quality stuff being flogged. But that is the answer, isn't it? We have outlet stores that are supposed to deal with that exact problem.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think a luxury handbag ending up in TK Maxx is worse than it ending up in a dumpster and going viral in TikTok necessarily. Like, brands need to be thinking about their reputations. And really, the issue with kind of the fashion industry is just way too many products being made, excessive surplus stock, and it's just too much for the demand that there is for it. And I think the fashion industry more so hasn't got an excuse anymore, really. What we're actually seeing these TikTokers bring to light isn't new. It's been going on for years. People know it's been going on for years. It's that a new generation care, and it's a generation who probably can't afford these goods themselves, but they're actually going to be put off even more so of ever aspiring to want to buy from those companies because this is how they behave.
Can companies get some PR credit for addressing it positively, do you think, Kate? I mean, you do see, don't you, in sandwich bars sometimes big signs proclaiming how at the end of the day they give away all their sandwiches rather than throw them away. Could we start seeing that in shops of all kinds? You know, this is something that people are proud of.
I think companies showing their green credentials and being loud and proud about them is only a good thing. And I, as a consumer, definitely that's something that I would find attractive if I was choosing between, say, as you said, two different sandwich outlets, and one of them was really kind of demonstrating how environmentally friendly they were. I would choose that one. And I think a lot of people of my generation and other generations would say the same. On the sandwich point, it's probably worth mentioning that actually Pret is really good for this. You know, they're all over the UK, as many of these listeners will know, and they have donated all their excess sandwiches, salads, wraps and baguettes since, I think, 1986. So they were quite ahead of their time in terms of redistributing their food waste.
And not prompted, clearly, Julia, by social media campaigns because they didn't exist then. So, I mean, is there now slightly an embarrassment if you do respond to this? I wonder if the contrary brand strategy would be to put your fingers in your ears and pretend it isn't happening. Just pretend TikTok doesn't exist. Be like, well, our customers are on Facebook.
Yeah, I think you can't get away with that anymore. Social, you know, these stories did break into newspapers. They're reaching people beyond the TikTok generation. And I think that's what is important, is that it's kind of sparking an intergenerational conversation as well, that brands and companies can't ignore. And I think consumers of all generations as well are increasingly concerned about these issues, particularly given, you know, the green issues we've been talking about already. You know, it's not just about younger consumers anymore. Okay,
Kate, I'm coming to you next after this. Kate, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Attention switching from incels to femcels.
This month, I've been kind of exposed or introduced to a new area of the internet with a very similar group who, they don't make me as angry, they just make me sad, if that makes sense. And that is the world of femcels. So basically the female equivalent of incels, despite the fact that apparently incels and femcels pretty much hate each other, which is fun.
YouTuber Rachel Oates discussing femcels last month. Kate, in case that wasn't clear, what is a femcel?
So much is written and known about the male incel movement that's made up of men who self-define as being involuntarily celibate, and they believe that feminism's resulted in male oppression, and they generally blame women, social justice movements and ethnic minorities for their own lack of relationships with the opposite sex. But less is known about a growing femcel movement of involuntarily celibate or single women who, like male incels, turn to online communities to help them feel supported and connected.
And how did this come to light?
So this story was in the news this week thanks to the publication of a really fascinating Guardian article by the journalist Lizzie Cernick. And she spoke to various women, some of whom identify as femcels, some of whom don't, but who have found kind of support from each other on online communities. And Lizzie said that while online male incel spaces, which are often found on social media platforms like Reddit or Facebook or 4chan, have become what she describes as a breeding ground for toxic male entitlement. Femcel places, on the other hand, are generally much more supportive, and they're places where women who often post anonymously can just come together and share the challenges they face.
But they're also presumably, Julia, much less popular. I mean, you know, you can sort of disparage Facebook and Reddit, but I mean, they're amongst the most popular websites in the world. It takes The Guardian to talk about femcels. Is it really a thing?
I hadn't come across femcels until Kate brought this article to our attention. It wasn't a corner of the internet I was aware of, so I guess it's probably quite a small movement. I think it's also had a recent resurgence because the word incel was actually originally coined by women in 1997, and it did refer to women who identified as involuntary celibates, and then was kind of co-opted by this extreme misogynist corner of the internet. Now women are kind of building a new community, reclaiming the movement through the word femcel. But yeah, I think it's growing.
I mean, what's interesting about it, John, is that whilst we associate incels with violence, femcels appears to be more of a support group for people who can't get laid, basically, which is, I guess, how the sort of male incel thing started, but it got sinister pretty quickly. Does that say something about the male psyche?
I think the whole thing says an awful lot about stuff in general. I mean, for example, the idea that, you know, that your kind of point there about not being able to get laid, I don't think that is explicitly actually what these women are complaining about as much. I mean, some of them talk about being, you know, missing a kind of physical relationship, but it's very much more that they can't find a man who they want to have a long-term relationship with. I mean, I think in a way it's a shame they've kind of nicknamed it the kind of femcel movement, because obviously the whole, you know, you can reclaim it if you want, but the incel thing is all about angry wee guys who are pissed off that they can't, you know, that Chad or whatever is going out with the cheerleaders or whatever it is that they feel that they deserve, whereas this is very much kind of like women who are just struggling to make connections with men for a wide range of reasons, and as tends to happen, the kind of, if you like, the kind of anger and any kind of violence even is internalised rather than directed at the opposite sex. So I think, yeah, it's a shame to kind of call it kind of femcel.
Well, whatever you call it can sound quite unflattering and misogynist, can't it, Kate? It's kind of interesting why they would want to be self-defined at all, because I suppose it's not new, is it? The idea of conventionally less attractive women talking to each other about how difficult it is to find a partner. In the old days, that was a spinster. You know, that word is now seen as being quite unpleasant. But is femcel really any better than that?
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that not all women who are part of this community would choose to define themselves as femcels. I think femcel is very much a kind of media word that's been attributed to this group, with some members of the community taking it on board, but others perhaps finding solace from these spaces, but not wanting to put themselves under the banner of being a femcel. But as John said, it is a lot more about just kind of not being able to get laid. I think that really simplifies what it's about, because I think these women say that because of the misogynistic culture we live in, they you know, it's really difficult for them to find someone that treats them with the respect that they deserve, for them to have kind of a wholesome relationship that fulfills them. It's about not wanting to settle for sex that's bad or sex that doesn't kind of treat them like an equal or validate them. It's also about women being afraid to date because of the fear of male violence. Obviously, a lot of the way that we meet new people these days is through dating apps like Tinder, which requires going to meet up with strangers. A lot of women in these communities feel afraid to do that because of the risks associated. So yeah, it's not about not being able to get laid. It's about kind of it being really hard to find the right men in this toxic, misogynistic culture that we live in.
It's also quite interesting, John. I can't work out whether if, you had a joint incel, femcel conference, whether they'd get on or not. Do you know what I mean? Because some of what the femcel movement appears to be saying is what the incels say, i.e., women can have sex with whoever they want whenever they want, but men can't because we're judged differently, is wrong. Look, here I am, I'm a woman and I'm not having sex. But at the same time, the fact that conversation's happening, it's the same conversation. So it's hard to tell whether they're in opposition or whether they agree.
I think what that hits the point is more, there's a kind of larger issue here, and it goes back to something that Julia was just saying about what some of the women are saying. I think as a society, we act as if it's really easy to meet the person of your dreams because that appears to be what happens to most people. But I also think that it's incredibly easy to just basically miss that boat. And I think it happens to a lot more people than we see. And the problem is that both, the incels, I would park that for a minute because, again, I think they're a different thing. But for example, with these women, they're mostly of an age where they're getting to the point where most of the people in their direct social circle are kind of pairing up with someone. They've clearly not met somebody at work. They've not met somebody at uni who was the one. And so they're getting to that point where it's actually difficult to meet people. And if you find dating online alienating, then that kind of becomes hard too. And I think it's that thing. It's just, I suppose, the bits where they say, I can't get a man because men all think if you don't fit in a Barbie box and do all the domestic duties, it can be quite upsetting. That's as much nonsense as it is the kind of wee incel talking about how he can't get a girlfriend because he's too nice or whatever. Take a walk around the street. There are loads of ugly people with partners. There just are. It's nothing to do with your looks. It may not even be anything to do with your personality. It's just a kind of... it's just that sometimes it's actually hard to meet people. I don't know about anyone else in this call, but I cannot say that I spent an awful lot of time dating, and I was so glad when I ended up getting married because it's just tricky to meet people and it's scary to kind of go out and and I think very few people are actually half as promiscuous as we kind of have in our imaginations, and I do think that's a fundamental problem with both sets here.
Kate, where do you think this conversation goes next? Is femcel going to be part of the modern lingua franca like incel?
I think the reason why incels are in the news as much as they are is because of their connection to violence. I think that femcels, on the other hand, are not going to make the news. They're not going to be talked about because, thankfully, it's a non-violent community. I think, though, what we will see is more and more kind of spaces for specifically aimed at single women and kind of communities where single women or involuntarily celibate women can come together to talk about the challenges that they face. And I think we'll just see more of these popping up, in newsletters, on podcasts, on websites and things like that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that personally. I think it's important for people to be able to find others in similar situations to them and talk to them about what they're going through.
Yeah, I suppose in a way it's a positive voice to hear more of, isn't it? If it wasn't happening in communities where people were just talking to each other, if you had more single women talking about how difficult it is for them and how they don't feel happy about that on the air, that would be useful.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why this Guardian article seemed to hit strike such a chord with so many people who read it, who really related to it. And I think it's interesting to point out that the woman who actually turned the cell incel, who Julia mentioned earlier, a woman called Alana, she actually has said that she she's distanced herself from the community, but she said that she kind of hopes that people will continue to create groups that bring lonely people together, which is what her initial involuntary celibacy project was kind of, that's what the aim of that was. And I think we are beginning to see groups and communities uniting lonely women, but also men. And I think that's really important, especially in this day when we're more disconnected than ever before.
I think what will be really interesting is broadening this conversation out beyond, Olly, you were saying single women. Actually, I was thinking, it's about talking about it with different generations, with your friends, your family, your trusted relationships. Because I think also, sometimes you get set up on a date because you were telling someone how much you wanted to meet a partner. We need to normalise having conversations about loneliness and how difficult it is to find people. And the only way of doing that is to kind of keep amplifying this.
Oh, God, yeah. Widow cell is going to be next, isn't it? You can predict it already. But that is it for this week's show. My thanks to Kate, Julia and John for their stories. Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And if you found us today via a Spotify playlist, tap Go to Podcast in the app and then tap Follow now. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.